13th of August 1940 is a bright sunny morning in Canberra. A little bit like the background there to the Hudson bomber, which is flying in that photograph. That's the world's only airworthy Hudson bomber, which flies out of Temora in southern New South Wales. The plane was coming from Melbourne. I might say this is the A16112, part of the third batch of 50 which was ordered by the Australian government. The one that crashed is the A1697, which was in the second batch of 50. So the planes are fairly closely related, although this one has a Wright Cyclone engines. The one that crashed had Pratt & Whitney's slightly less power. The plane was coming from Melbourne to Canberra. It was a light bomber, but had been converted for VIP use. So the bomb racks had been taken out and 6 passenger seats had been put into the main cabin, and a set of dual controls was put in the co-pilot's position. When it was in bomber mode, the co-pilot's controls would be taken out so that the bomb aimer could crawl down into the nose there and aim the bombs. The headquarters of the Defence Department remained in Melbourne throughout the war because Canberra was too small to host what even then was quite a big department. And so VIP flights used to occur between Melbourne and Canberra as people were brought to the national capital for cabinet meetings and for the meetings of the Commonwealth Parliament. And aboard this plane were all the leaders of the Australian war effort, with the exception of Prime Minister Menzies, who was waiting at Parliament House in Canberra. So the plane came in, it came over the Brindabella Mountains. It made one left-hand circuit around Canberra, which isn't as big a deal as it sounds because there are only about 10,000 people who lived there in those days. And then it proceeded to make a second circuit. It was noticed over Queanbeyan. There are quite a number of witnesses in Queanbeyan, people at the goods shed, people in a motor mechanics shop, people out working on farms. There are also a number of witnesses at the aerodrome, people waiting for the plane to land. And the wind was blowing from the west at about 24 knots, nothing for a plane like this, and it proceeded to make its final approach though into the wind. So it came over Queanbeyan, which is east of Canberra, and lined up for its final approach. There were no runways at Canberra in those days. It was an all-over landing ground. And the plane was noticed by many, and all the inquiries found this later on to be basically going too low and too slow. You might have heard that phrase recently. It was used to describe the approach of the plane into San Francisco airport, which crashed a few weeks ago. Now, if you know that part of Canberra, you'll know there's a ridge that runs parallel to what's now the main north-south runway on one side and the Sutton Road on the other side. And the plane had to clear this ridge to get into the aerodrome. Most things in Canberra are named after politicians. This ridge does not bear a name, which is quite unusual in Canberra. It's not a particularly distinct landmark unless you're a pilot, in which case it looms quite large. And if you take off from Canberra Airport, and depending on where you're sitting in the plane, even today, where a plane banks, you might well find a window full of pine trees, so to speak, and that means you're over that ridge. Well, at some point, as the pilot got closer to this ridge, he realised that he was not going to clear it unless he did something. So he put his power on and he eased the nose up to try and cheat his way over the ridge. Now the Lockheed manual would have told him, and Lockheed in Burbank, California were the makers of this aircraft, that to do that was an extremely dangerous manoeuvre, and so it turned out with this aircraft, which went into a left wing down stall, which is to say the left wing dropped and the nose went down and the plane crashed, and all 10 people on board were incinerated. Now this was a catastrophe for the Menzies government. He at that stage had a majority of about 8 in the House of Representatives, but of the 6 people on board, 3 were very senior ministers. Geoffrey Street, the Minister for the Army, Sir Henry Gullett, the Minister for Information, and James Fairbairn, the Minister for Air. And each of them held a lower house seat. So Menzies was faced with the prospect of 3 by-elections, but he approached the Governor-General and said, would you bring the election forward? There was a general election due later in the year. And the Governor-General agreed to that. Now, Menzies campaigned indifferently during the campaign. We had a commemoration yesterday at the Air Disaster Memorial site. It was the 73rd anniversary yesterday, and Heather Henderson was there, Sir Robert Menzies' only surviving child. She reminded me how devastated her father was at the loss of these 3 men, because they were not only his very close political colleagues, they were his very close friends. And he went into the campaign fairly disturbed and upset and did not campaign well. And the result was, with John Curtin campaigning very well, especially in New South Wales, a hung parliament where the balance of power was held by two independents, Arthur Coles and Alex Wilson. And Arthur Coles won the seat of Henty, which had been vacated by Sir Henry Gullett's death. He was a good friend of Menzies. Menzies did not stand any candidate against him because it was assumed that Coles would support Menzies, which he in fact did, as did Alex Wilson. So the new Parliament reconvened and business went on. Menzies, however, had a problem, and that was that he had not fought in World War I. He had his reasons. He had two older brothers, both of whom had fought and both of whom were very seriously wounded. And their mother, Kate, said, "That's enough, I'm not sending the third son." And the reality was that Menzies' family did far more than most Australian families did by way of contributing sons to the war. And had he been anybody except a very prominent public figure, I don't think any more would have been said. The other thing that needs to be said is that Menzies did campaign very strongly in favour of conscription, knowing that had the ballot been won and it was only narrowly lost, that he would have been one of the first men to be called up, being single, being a fit man and with some military training. So you couldn't call him a shirker. But politics is a pretty brutal business, and it doesn't matter what may pass for acceptable behaviour in private life doesn't pass for acceptable behaviour in public life if people are out to get you, and there were plenty of people out to get Menzies. And as Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd know, your own worst enemies are actually on your own side of politics, which is what I found out when I was in Parliament too. And so it turned out with Menzies. And there are a number of people on his own side who bitterly resented him for being a Prime Minister in wartime when he had not served in World War I. And they, having served, believed they deserved the job more than he did. And so they set out to white-hand him. Now, so long as these three cabinet ministers were alive, they were Menzies' Praetorian Guard and they guarded his back, so to speak, and he was, in political terms, okay. And the reason why they were able to protect him from this sort of stuff was that they were very distinguished World War I veterans. Geoffrey Street had landed at Gallipoli on day one. He was the youngest infantry officer ever to enlist in the 1st AIF. He fought his way right through the war to the last days Australians were engaged in combat on the Western Front in 1918, and he won a Military Cross along the way. He was a brigadier in 1938, and had he not become, at that point, Defence Minister, I think he probably would have been one of the fighting Major Generals of World War II. People like Stan Savage and Leslie Morshead, nobody remembers those names these days, unfortunately, but they're very important names in Australian history. And he would have been in that rank of people. But anyway, at the time of the crash, he was Army Minister. James Fairbairn, the Air Minister, had been a very distinguished World War I fighter pilot, been shot down by the Germans and captured. 10 planes took him on. He managed to shoot 2 down before being downed himself, and he had a very fine reputation. And Sir Henry Gullett was the third person. He'd ridden with a light horse in Palestine, written volume 7 of the official history, which Charles Bean said was the best volume of all those written. So these guys supporting Menzies meant that he was bulletproof in the party room. When they died, that changed. Ironically, Arthur Coles, who'd also landed on day one at Gallipoli, believed in Menzies as a Conservative leader, and to try and help him out, joined the coalition party room, joined the government party room, stepped down from the crossbench, joined the government party room to back Menzies up. But in my opinion, Menzies made a bad mistake at the beginning of 1941, which is to say he spent 5 months in England. He had his reasons, some of which I think were quite legitimate, but I think overwhelmingly public opinion was that he should be in Canberra, not in London. And so the naysayers were busy while he was away. And not long after he got back, 2 junior ministers, both of whom later became Prime Ministers, Harold Holt and John McEwen, came to him and said it's time to go. And after considering this and testing the waters and so forth, I think like Kevin Rudd the first time round, rather than face a leadership ballot, he stepped down. Well, Arthur Coles was just livid about this, stormed out of the government party room and went back and sat on the crossbenches and said that Menzies had been lynched. That was the word that he used, very strong language, and he bided his time for revenge. Well, it wasn't long in coming. Arthur Fadden became the new Conservative leader, and he brought in the 1941-42 budget. He was also Treasurer, and Coles waited until about day 3 of the debate and then stood up and made it very plain that he'd be supporting a motion moved by John Curtin. And the motion was an amendment to the budget. At that time, about £8,000 was under consideration for Senate salaries, and Curtin moved that the amount be reduced by £1. And that was enough to throw the future of the government wide open if that sort of motion passed. And Coles got up and said, "I'm supporting the amendment." And Alex Wilson did likewise. The amendment was passed, Parliament was adjourned. Fadden went to the Governor-General and said, "Your Excellency, I can't continue. I've lost the confidence of the House. I suggest you ask Mr Curtin to form a government," which happened. In my opinion, if this crash hadn't happened, John Curtin would never have been Prime Minister of Australia. I think Menzies would have won the 1940 election narrowly. Certainly he would have had Henry Gullett as the member for Henty. And then with Pearl Harbor, I think he would have won the 1943 election with the enemy at the gates in New Guinea. Curtin was also under pressure at the time. He was getting very, very vigorously scrutinised by Eddie Ward and Bert Everett in particular, and they believed that he wasn't hungry enough for office. And if Menzies had stayed in till 46, I don't think Curtin ever would have been Prime Minister. So this crash precipitated a major, major turning point in Australian history. And as somebody from the Conservative side of politics, I'm the first to concede that John Curtin was an outstanding Prime Minister. And it's interesting to contemplate that but for this it wouldn't have happened. I think the other thing resulting out of this crash is that it inverted the order of politics in Australia. If Menzies had won in 1940 and 1943 and perhaps been kicked out in 46 or 49, we would have seen Labor governments during the 1950s. And so the order of politics, I think, was reversed as a result of this crash. And it's not often you find an incident which is a particular trigger to consequences, but I think this was one such. So that's enough of the politics. How does a plane like this fall out of the sky? Well, it was a very advanced aircraft for its era. It was a new type of aircraft. It's a little bit hard to see from that photo, but because it's distorted slightly, unfortunately. But the aircraft has short, stumpy, tapered wings, basically. Quite a big fuselage, and take my word for it, it is a very high-powered aircraft from the engine point of view. What this means is that in the air it is very, very manoeuvrable and has some of the flying characteristics of a fighter of its era, of course. And indeed, Japanese Zero pilots captured, that's to say Japanese fighter pilots who were interrogated about Allied types of aircraft, said that they were amazed by the Hudson bomber. They'd see them in the air and say, "Oh, this will be easy," line up behind them, and then the pilot would just duck and weave like this, and they were very, very difficult to shoot down, even in a fighter aircraft. But like all things in design, something that gives you an advantage like that also comes at a cost. So for every design advantage you get in one direction, you get a corresponding deficit in another direction. And the deficit with this aircraft is that it glides like a brick, which is to say it does not glide at all. And so, unlike all the earlier types of aircraft, it could not be glided into land, which is to say it couldn't just ease off the throttles and use the weight of the aircraft and the spread of the wings to just float down. You had to drive the aircraft into the ground. And the way that they are driven in, as they drove me into Temora, is you have a very steep angle of attack like this, very hard and fast, and you pull up at the last minute. That's the way you land a Hudson bomber. Now, there are a number of things the inquiries agreed on. There was a coronial inquiry, 2 RAAF inquiries and a judicial inquiry. And they all agreed that, first of all, the aircraft was in perfect working order. Mechanics, riggers, engineers have been crawling all over the thing, making sure that it was fit for flying, and everybody signed off their worksheets. It had been a very closely guarded aircraft, as you might imagine, being a VIP plane, and that was all investigated too. It was a brand new aircraft that only had 7 hours on the clock, so to all intents and purposes there was nothing whatever wrong with the machine itself, and so they all found. The next thing the inquiries found was that the plane was flying too low and too slow, that the angle of attack was too shallow, that the engines were powered up and the nose eased up as the approach to the hill was made, and that the immediate cause of the accident was a left wing down stall, and that the stall was caused by pilot error. The only question was who was flying the plane. Now, there were a total of 10 people on board. Apart from the 3 ministers, there was the Chief of the General Staff, General Brudenell White, the first Australian to hold the active rank of full general in wartime, a World War I hero, the mastermind behind the Gallipoli evacuation, or the Anzac Cove evacuation, I should say. There was Lieutenant Colonel Thornthwaite, who was his Chief of Staff, and there was Richard Elford, who was the Private Secretary to the Minister for Air. And then there were 4 RAAF crew, a wireless operator, an aircraft rigger mechanic right in the back of the plane, and the pilot and the co-pilot. 3 pilots in all on board the aircraft that day. Flight Lieutenant Bob Hitchcock was the captain of the aircraft. He had some question marks against his early flying career, but in Hudson type aircraft he had had 107 incident-free hours, which is all but the most experienced Hudson pilots. He was qualified to fly this plane in terms of landings into Canberra. He'd flown a plane identical to this one into Canberra on a previous occasion, the same approach, and had had no problems. And he was rated by his squadron leader to be an above average Hudson pilot. The co-pilot, Richard Weissner, was a very promising young officer, but he didn't know how to fly Hudson bombers, and he was there that day only as an observer. And the 3rd pilot was the Minister for Air, James Fairbairn. Now, Fairburne, in addition to being a World War I fighter pilot, had maintained his flying credentials after the war, was qualified to fly 25 different types of aircraft, and at the time of the crash held the round Australia airspeed record. He was Australia's premier private pilot, and he wanted to fly Hudson bombers. And we know this because towards the end of his tour around Australia, he stopped at an Adelaide trade school and spoke to the headmaster. I'm going to read this to you. The headmaster was also a qualified pilot, and they got talking about Hudson bombers. And this principal was so disturbed about what Fairburn told him when he later heard that this plane had crashed that he wrote this letter to the inquiry. And all he ever got back was a pro forma reply, and nobody ever bothered to get in touch with him. So this is what he wrote. Mr. Fairburn told me something of his trip round Australia, and we talked about Hudson bombers. These machines have a rather nasty stalling characteristic, Mr. Fairburn said. The combined effect of throttling back and dropping the flaps preparatory to landing can land you in a whole heap of bother. They're very sensitive at this stage to varying air pressures, and from what I've been told, the pilot coming into land can find himself suddenly and without warning in a machine that's no longer airborne heading straight for the ground. I don't know much about them yet, but as I'll be using a Hudson for my ministerial travel, I soon will. And this is the most important bit. On every possible occasion, I'll practice landings and find out more about this stalling trick. Personally, I think it's only a matter of handling your throttles wisely. Now, I think what happened is that, possibly even before they took off, Fairburn stepped up, tapped Weissner on the shoulder and said, "You go down and sit in my seat, I'll sit in yours. I'm just going to sit up here and observe." The plane went to take off from Essendon Airport, and there was an unexplained 15-minute delay. The plane turned to address the runway on the piano keys, as I've discovered pilots call the start line on a runway. Planes don't muck around at that point. They actually often accelerate into the final turn out of the taxiway into the runway. This Hudson, which had absolute priority through air traffic control, sat there for 15 minutes. And the air traffic controller was so concerned about the delay because he had student pilots buzzing around in the sky. It was a training aerodrome, but he was watching his watch very closely. And nobody could explain this delay. And I think it's quite likely there that the switch took place. It's got to be said too that there was a short flight from Laverton RAAF base to Essendon where the plane picked up the VIPs. And on approach into Essendon, where Hitchcock was in charge of the aircraft, the plane was seen to make a perfect Hudson landing, which is to say it was driven in very hard, very fast from a steep angle of attack, and Hitchcock was later complimented by the Tower for making a perfect landing. There's a lot of other evidence, forensic evidence from the wreckage, evidence of what firemen found and one thing and another, that I think goes to support this theory that Fairburn was flying the aircraft when it crashed. I won't go into all that, but I think there's a strong and compelling case. It is circumstantial. There are elements of it which wouldn't be admissible in a court of law, but certainly as somebody writing about history I think I'm entitled to use, providing I make it clear what I'm doing and that it's my opinion. And I think though that on the evidence that was admissible, the inquiries would have been much fairer if they had concluded that it was impossible to say who the pilot was. I think that's certainly a conclusion on the evidence. And indeed the judicial inquiry, headed by a very experienced Victorian Supreme Court judge, had terrible strife trying to name Hitchcock, and only did so by connection, by saying basically, point one, that the crash was caused by pilot error, and point two, that the only person qualified to fly the Hudson was Hitchcock. Both of those things are correct, but the rest of it was left to inference to join up the dots, that one led to the other. And I think that's unfair. And if the Commissioner believed that Hitchcock was flying the plane, he should have damn well said so. And the fact that he didn't, I think, is most unfortunate and caused Hitchcock's family extraordinary grief for 70 years, as I discovered yesterday when a couple of the children turned up for this memorial service. That's how I think the aircraft came to crash. Now, just in conclusion, I'd just like to run through a few things. When I write, I try as far as I can to experience, what happened so I can write better about these things. And in some cases it's very difficult. With Lord Sydney, it was very difficult because he never came here. All his papers were in Michigan, and I went to Michigan rather than London to follow the paper trail rather than his trail in terms of where he lived and so forth. With Wentworth, a little easier, because Vaucluse House exists to this day. The Supreme Court in King Street was the court where he practiced, and his country home at Windermere still stands. So what do you do with a Hudson bomber? Well, I tried to learn all I could about them. I'm not a pilot. I was acutely aware that this book might fail badly if I got some of the flying details wrong, and there would be any number of pilots to pull me up if I made fundamental mistakes on the technical flying side. So I ran it past a number of pilots I knew, including Qantas 747 captains and my own son, who's a flying instructor, and various other people. And then when the book was very close to the point of no return at the publishers and on a fairly tight publishing schedule, I discovered that there was an airworthy Hudson bomber in Temora in southern New South Wales. So I rang the publisher and said, there's a flying day down at Temora on the 3rd of November. You've got to put this book on hold until I get down and see this thing in the air. And so they agreed to do that with some reluctance. So I went down to Temora to this flying day. And that day they were flying the Hudson, they were flying a Spitfire, they were flying a Tiger Moth, and they were flying a Vietnam-era jet. So I went down there thinking I would be simply watching the plane in the air, listening to it, watching the way it moved around, watching the way it approached to land, very importantly, watching the way it took off, and maybe if I was lucky, getting to crawl around in it on the ground. So all those things happened. The plane went up and did its thing, and then I was about to go. I had a plane to catch back in Wagga, and this guy came over to me in full flying gear and said, "Are you the bloke writing the book about the Hudson bomber crash in Canberra?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm the captain of the Hudson today, and do you want to go up?" And I said, "Do I want to go up? Of course I want to go up." And he said, "Oh, well, you might have to change your travel arrangements." And I said, "Look, I'm happy to hitchhike back to Sydney if I can get a flight on this Hudson." So he said, "All right, well, that's good. Wait here. I'll come back in a minute." So he went away and he came back with a sheaf of papers about this thick and said, "You better sign this. You've got to sign this before we take you up." So I said, "I guess that's a waiver." And he said, "Yes, it's a waiver." I said, "Well, you may or may not know, Temora Aviation Museum is funded by the Lowy family. So every time you go to Westfield, you're helping to keep the Hudson in the air. Thank you." So I said, "Well, this waiver's no doubt drafted by Frank Lowy's lawyers." And he said, "Yeah, it probably is." "Well, what's the point of me trying to read it? I either want to go up in this aircraft or I don't, so I sign it or I don't, so I sign." He said, "All right, wait here, I'll be back." He comes back a little later with his co-pilot. They say, now, here are your headphones and here's your microphone. This aircraft is like an aluminium Coke tin. Once we get these right cyclone engines powered up, you will not be able to hear yourself shout at the top of your voice. So that turned out to be. So you will need to speak to us, we will need to speak to you, so you've got to wear these headphones. And then I noticed that each of them was carrying a crash helmet. And I said, well, where's my crash helmet? And they said, you don't get a crash helmet. We get crash helmets because the regulations require it, but you don't get one. Oh, that's good. So what happens if we crash? And you've got crash helmets and I don't. He said, Andrew, I'll let you into a little secret. If this plane crashes, it doesn't matter whether you're wearing a crash helmet or not. So there's this author photograph in the back of the book of the three of us just before we went up, and these two guys have got their crash helmets and their flying kit on, and I'm sort of standing nervously in the middle with this massive engine and set of blades behind there. So we got on board, and then they said, you're going to sit in the radio operator's seat, which is located behind the pilot on the left-hand side, where the seat's at right angles to the direction of the plane. So you look out over the port wing, and there's a little table there and radio and all that sort of stuff. So that's where you'll be sitting. You only need to be strapped in for takeoff and landing, otherwise you can wander around the plane as far as we're concerned. And they looked me up and down and said, if you can demonstrate to us you can get up into that gun turret, we'll let you go up there during flight. So luckily, there aren't too many positive sides of having radiation for throat cancer, but one of them is when I had my radiation, it's a great way to lose about 30 kilos in about 3 weeks. So in my pre-radiation days, I wouldn't have had a ghost of a chance of getting up into that turret. But having lost all the weight, I managed to wriggle up there quite easily. So they said, all right, you can go up there in flight, providing you promise us one thing, don't press the button. I said, well, I won't press the button. They said, it's not what you think. Although there are machine gun barrels and you can see them sticking out of the back of the turret, they were disabled years ago because we don't like our guests shooting off the tail fins. And what this button does is it releases the turret, and the turret will then spin around. And it's not a round turret, it's not completely circular in shape, and the gun barrels are very heavy and it will just swing. And we don't like surprises in the cockpit, and if you press that button the plane will sort of go like this, and we don't like surprises, so don't press it. All's good. And then they said you could also stand behind us in the cockpit and take photos out of the cockpit window if you want to. Behind the pilot's seat there is a metal bulkhead, which is to say a sort of a metal partition, and behind the co-pilot's seat there is a metal partition as well, and running behind them is the main wing strut, which you've got to step up from the main cabin over it into the sort of cockpit area. So I could chop my left shoulder against the left bulkhead and the right shoulder against the right bulkhead, have two free hands, and then, you know, with a digital camera bought from JB Hi-Fi or somewhere like that, or Dick Smith, I could click away if the occasion arose. So all was good. I got strapped in and off we went. Well, when we got up, we threw the plane around a bit. He started to go through his manoeuvres, and that is me taking that shot, and that's the captain there on the left, Doug Hamilton. And I don't know if you can pick up the horizon there, but we're over at about 70 degrees there. And the aircraft is flying. It is in aerodynamic flight. It is under control. And this is very similar to the scene that would have presented itself to the aircraft that crashed if you were looking out the cockpit window. There are a couple of differences though. One is that this plane is in controlled flight. It is banking steeply, but nevertheless it is flying. Once the aircraft that crashed was at this attitude, it was stalling. It had lost its aerodynamic lift. It was starting to drop. The second thing is that you can probably make out there some individual gum trees, but it's not easy to do so. In the plane that crashed, once the aircraft had reached that angle, the pilot would have been able to make out individual gum tree branches that would have been that close to the ground. The third thing is that the dials on the main control panel there, again indicating the plane in controlled flight. I think by this stage on the plane that crashed, the pilot would have been revving the engines, just doing anything to try and escape imminent death, and the needles would have been a lot further round. My publisher saw this photograph, forgave me for holding up the production, and said we've got to use this photo. And it actually appears on the front inside cover of the book and in the inside itself. So that was banking to the left, and then we banked to the right. If you see the cockpit strut there, lining up against the line of natural bushland in the middle of that canola field, you can see they're virtually in alignment. Still in controlled flight. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be here. And it just demonstrates what extraordinary aircraft these planes were and why fighters did find them very hard to shoot down. But the very aspects of the design of the plane that allowed it to do this and allows pilots to do this to this day, they're the very aspects that make it so dangerous to land if you try and glide it in like a traditional aircraft. Well, then I went up into the gun turret, and that was interesting. And this final shot, I'm up in the gun turret, and so you're actually sitting up above the aircraft, and that shot's taken forward with the radio mast in the centre of the fuselage there, and the starboard engine there flogging away over Tamora's fields. And you just literally feel like you're riding on top of the plane. It's the most extraordinary sensation, but of course in wartime that is the most dangerous place to be in the aircraft, because fighter planes close in on you from the rear. And as in all bombers, the tail gunner is the most exposed of the crew, and their shelf life very, very short indeed. They in fact showed me they had a special drill for dragging a minced up tail gunner out of that position and somebody replacing them. It happens so frequently. I'd read that when pilots were being trained up to fly on Hudsons, and you had to be a very good Hudson pilot to even be considered for the program, because the type of craft was so new, they used to go up to about 7,000 or 8,000 feet with the instructor, find a level piece of cloud, and then the instructor would say to the student pilot, go and land on that piece of cloud. So the student would come in, the gear would come down, the flaps would come down. This was the first plane ever to have flaps, by the way. You can see the flap rails there on the trailing edge of the wing. But you sit in a Qantas jet looking out a window near the trailing edge of a Qantas jet, you will see on approach to land the flaps, you can actually see them come down. Well, this is the first plane ever to have them, which was another reason why it was difficult to fly. So the instructor would say, okay, you're making your approach, now throttle back, throttle back, throttle back, so the student would ease back on the throttles. Plane would approach the stall, so it would get very sluggish in the air and quite difficult to manage. And then the instructor would say, right, give it full power. The plane would go then left wing down and then go straight over on its back and start falling upside down. At 7,000 feet, you had enough height to recover. But the instructor would always say to the student, that's the lesson of flying a Hudson. Don't muck about with them, don't throttle back and then power up, because you won't get away with it. The lesson is come in hard and fast in the first place. You cannot recover a plane like this if your angle is too shallow and you throttle back too far. And unfortunately, that is the flying lesson that James Fairburn never had. Had he just done that one flying test with the instructor, I don't think the crash would have happened. He was a good enough pilot to pick that sort of stuff up very quickly, very bright man, but that was the test he didn't have. So I said to the captain of the Hudson, Doug Hamilton, will you do a left wing down stall, Doug? Will you take me up to 7,000 feet and do a left wing down stall? I want to experience this because I've got to write about it. Oh, at that stage it was changed chapter 24. And he said, no, Andrew, I'm not suicidal. This aircraft is 72 years old, and I'm not going to, endanger the aircraft. It is too old to do that sort of thing, so I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. So I then went to my son, who's a flying instructor and flies Piper Warriors, which is they're a very stable aircraft, a good training aircraft. And I said, Pete, will you take me up and do a left wing down stall? So we went up in the training area over the Nepean River, and we did a couple of standard stalls, which is sort of, you flutter up like this and drop back and recover. And I said, all right, will you do a left wing down stall for me? And he said, Dad, I don't even know if this machine will do a left wing down stall. We'll have a go. Well, sure enough, it didn't. And then he said, well, I'll try giving it a bit of left rudder and see if I can get a wing dropping by doing that. And so he gave it some left rudder, and nothing happened for a second, and then the left wing just went like that, and we just dropped straight down like a stone. And I got the sensation I was after, which is your stomach comes up in your mouth, the seatbelt really starts to bite into you, and in my case, I got very, very disoriented. You start grabbing for all sorts of things in the cockpit just to get stability. So after about what seemed to me like an eternity, but in his case I think he said about a second and a half, he looked at me and he must have conjured up in his brain every insult, every slight I'd ever hurled his way as his father, and there'd been a few. And then in this wicked little smile he said, "Have you had enough yet?" And I said, "Yes, I want to go home, Pete." And so he then pulled the aircraft up and back to Bankstown we went. So that's the story of the Hudson bomber crash. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Andrew, a couple of questions. First one is, I presume that because of the technology or diligence in those days, or because the plane was so incinerated, they couldn't tell who the pilot was. Is that the case? They couldn't?
Well, there's a big event going on down in Questacon tonight where some forensic scientists who are going over this. But we did a dry run last night and did a dress rehearsal. They got me on film, but the forensic scientists are there live, and so I heard what they had to say. And there are a number of things that are available today that weren't available then, such as a very advanced capacity to work up fingerprints from bodies that are very badly incinerated. These are people who've been to the aftermath of the tsunami, to some very, very big plane crashes where there have been intense fires, bushfire events where there are fatalities. And this amazed me, they were saying in all cases except the bushfire events, funnily enough, there was always enough residue to be able to get fingerprints and DNA. The really scary thing is that in the Victorian bushfires, they said the bodies were so badly burnt that there was nothing, not even teeth. The incredible temperatures generated by those firestorms that hit those Victorian towns. And that was news to me. I had no idea that the temperatures were that high. So they got those techniques, and in a crash where the thing, this thing burned fiercely, they would, if under today's technology, be able to get fingerprints, believe it or not, from very badly burned corpses. And of course there would be a black box today. There were no black boxes in those days. But there were some very basic errors made, even for the circumstances of the time. And it all began when the RAAF got control of the crash site. The aerodrome and the airbase was very nearby the crash site. And the RAAF turned up and cordoned the place off. And so the Commonwealth Police, who had jurisdiction in the ACT, and it did crash in the ACT, were outside the cordon, so to speak. And the flight lieutenant in charge authorised the removal of the bodies before they'd been tagged. He let them be taken to the morgue, which is just a fundamental error. What should have happened at the very least is that each body should have been tagged, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then somebody should have done a diagram of the wreckage and should then have put, in terms of the tag bodies, A, B, C, whatever, 1 to 10, in various places where the bodies were situated. And then they might have had a fighting chance of figuring out whether, in relation to the cockpit, which was the worst banged up area, there was a civilian up there, or Fairburn in particular. He did have a distinguishing characteristic, a very bad war wound to his right arm, which may or may not have been able to identify him in the crash. But all those things were lost. And the other thing was that in New South Wales, as you know if you've been to the Justice and Police Museum and seen the police display, they used to do forensic crime scene photography for murders from about 1920 onwards. So it's quite likely that if the police had been in charge of the crime scene, that a photographer might have been called in to take photographs. I can't say that with certainty, but certainly it was practice in New South Wales in murder cases and cases of suspicious deaths. So these were opportunities that were lost. There were other things that pointed in that direction. There was a Canberra fireman, Tom Hines, who tripped over what he thought was a burning log and discovered that it was a body. And something about it led him to think that the wrong person was flying the aircraft. He was never called to give evidence, but this came to light about 7 or 8 years ago on the 7:30 report in ABC Canberra, when a lot of these people were interviewed in their old age. But rudimentary forensic tests of the day were not deployed, unfortunately. And the moral of the story is, it doesn't matter what sort of a crash it is, wartime or any other time, the only people who should be allowed to be in control of the scene are the police.
You said it was difficult to get to the site. Is it public land? Is it
It's
Is it signed, or-
it's controlled by the by TAMS, which is the Territory and Municipal Services Department in the ACT. After a lot of jumping up and down, there's been quite a lot of media interest in this in Canberra. There's a great article in the Canberra Times today out of yesterday, and there's been some TV down there and radio and one thing and another. The government is under pressure to fix it. They have gone some of the way. They've now better signposted a walking track up there, which we're grateful for. They've also regraded the road, but it is still a dirt road. And if Canberra's weather on Monday had been Canberra's weather yesterday, we would not have been able to drive up there. And it was a characteristic of a lot of people who wanted to go up there that they were over 80. And so walking 1.3 k's along a muddy bush track was out of the question. Luckily it dried out in time and they were all able to drive up there. Otherwise we would have had a memorable media moment, I think. And we're grateful for that. What we want is we want a black-topped road up there so people can get up there. The problem with the site is that it is remote and idiots get up there and deface it and commit acts of vandalism and so forth, and I accept that, and it can't be open all the time to cars, but there ought to be a regular occasion, say once a month, 3 hours, where it's publicly advertised that you can go up there during daylight hours, and I have rangers up there to keep an eye on things, and then they close the gates at the end of the day. It always strikes me as very ironic that in Canberra, where there are all these magnificent sort of memorials to the fallen, that in relation to Canberra's own worst disaster, and this was Canberra's worst disaster ever in terms of lives lost, there's this remote memorial you can't get to. The other thing is that the memorial plaque, which was unveiled by Menzies in 1960, was in a pretty disgraceful state, and Julia Gillard promised Barry O'Farrell that it would be fixed. And to our absolute delight yesterday, we got up there, it was a complete surprise. There was a brand new brass plaque up there set in, beautiful granite. And I came away with a mental note that poor woman suffered a fair bit lately. I was going to write to her and thank her for seeing that that was done. It's a wonderful thing, in my opinion, and gave these next of kin great comfort yesterday. So, I think there needs to be better access up there, and it is a very important historical event, this, and it should be better understood.
I'm wondering why a military plane which was to carry heavy bomb load would have such a small wing capacity so that it couldn't even glide. For a plane that depend on so much power to keep it in flight, the fuel usage would have been enormous if it just had another 20% of wing area, which would have reduced the fuel need and made it so much more manoeuvrable for these safety issues. Your son must have commented on this sort of thing, I would have thought.
Oh, sure, everybody does. Look, the history of the plane is this, that it was originally a civilian aircraft. It was a Lockheed Electra, and there were planes of its type in civilian use in Australia in the late 1930s. A civilian version of it was flown, or I should say Neville Chamberlain flew in a civilian version of it when he went to Munich in 1938. And when he came back and famously stepped out of the aircraft with a piece of paper signed by Herr Hitler, as he said, peace in our time, the backdrop was a Lockheed Electra. And later on it formed the backdrop to the final scene in Casablanca where Bogart says goodbye to Ingrid Bergman. So it had a very significant civilian use. Now what happened was the British, right at the outbreak of World War II, realised that their machines were being outclassed by German aircraft in this category of plane. And so they went in, not a panic exactly, but they were motivated, and they went to the United States to try and find a plane they could get off the shelf in a hurry. And they ended up in Burbank, saw this plane, not this one, but saw the civilian version and said, can you convert that to a light bomber? And they did, and that's how a civilian plane became a light bomber. They were effective. A plane like this was in the RAAF was credited as being the first aircraft to shoot down a German plane in World War II. They were good planes against submarines. They were used for escort duty for the convoys. When the first big convoy went out of here with troops on it in World War II, pretty sure this is right, it was guarded by Hudson bombers till it got off Albany somewhere and got away. And for a light bomb load, they were effective. So it was a bit of a scissors and paste type job really, but compared to the aircraft it replaced, the Anson bomber, even though the Anson had the gliding characteristics, this plane carried a bigger load. But you know, not to be confused with heavy bombers, not to be confused with, you know, G for George down there in the War Memorial, which is a massive aircraft with 4 engines, and you know, they fly over Germany and all this junk at very high altitude. This is a light bomber plane, but the Australians, I think we ordered some hundreds of them, and they were used in the South Pacific, used in New Guinea and places further afield in the Japanese War. And I think about 2,500 of them were built overall, and they were used extensively throughout the war. So that, you know, for the type of plane, it was a successful aircraft, but dangerous, you know, if you didn't know how to fly it.
The Air Force Base in Canberra, is that named after Fairburn?
It is, but I think it's been decommissioned. Everything's named after Fairburn down there. People say to me, well, if you think he was flying the plane, do you think they need to change all these names? And I said, no, not at all. To me, Fairbairn's a hero. It might sound odd, but he was a very, very great Minister for Air. What do I mean? Well, he understood pilots. He was a hero to pilots. He was personally responsible for getting landing fields put in all over the Australian continent. He's one of the first pilots ever to fly around Australia and realised the critical significance of aerodromes being available for emergency landings. The other thing he was very big on was putting in radio beacons, which were, again, another huge safety issue. And he did all that. And his intention was laudable, which was to fly, his intention was to fly every type of aircraft which people in the RAAF flew so he could understand their problems. And so he was well motivated. The problem was that on this aircraft, he didn't do the stall test. People flew planes they shouldn't be strictly qualified to fly, and it's happened until quite recently. I was desperate to find another example of this to put this in perspective, and there was a fellow called Sir Valston Hancock who was head of the RAAF in the 1960s, and he flew a B-47 bomber, which was an interim replacement for the Canberra bomber before the swing wing, you know, F-111 came into play, and they were looking at this B-47 as an interim replacement. They didn't choose it in the end. Well, Hancock wasn't qualified to fly it, and he flew it all the way from Sydney to somewhere or other, and Amberley, and crash landed it at Amberley. And so, you know, this was not unknown. Legally, Hitchcock was in charge of the aircraft, and even though a mere flight lieutenant saying no to an Air Minister is in human terms almost an impossibility, especially if the Air Minister was as assertive as James Fairburn, there is no question that Hitchcock had the legal authority to do that, and it's as true today as anywhere else. So, you know, President Obama in Air Force One can say, oh, I want to go to Sydney, not Melbourne, but on approach to Sydney Airport, he's got to stay out of the cockpit like everybody else and cannot tell, you know, the Air Force Colonel what to do. That's just an iron rule. So Hitchcock has to bear responsibility for letting Fairburn fly because it was his legal right to say no, however improbable that would have been in human terms.
There were other Fairbairns in politics, weren't there?
Yeah, David Fairburn was often thought to be a son of James Fairburn. He wasn't. He was a nephew. He was one of the Fairburn family, but he was a nephew. I think Anne Fairburn is his wife, now I remember it.
He too was Minister for Air too?
He might have been. He was certainly Minister for Defence when McMahon was Prime Minister. Jim Fairburn did have a son. His name was Geoffrey. He was a commando in World War II, and he became a very senior academic at the ANU after the war. He was a favourite of Manning Clark's, even though their politics were diametrically opposed. Fairburn was a conservative, and he was an authority on counterinsurgency in the Vietnam War, and a sort of conservative commentator on all that. But he never went into politics. I don't think he was even tempted to go into politics. He died some years ago. But interestingly, Manning Clark gave the eulogy at his funeral. Some others did go into politics. Geoffrey Street's son went into politics, Tony Street, and Tony became Foreign Minister under Malcolm Fraser. Tony's still alive, but he was too old to come yesterday, unfortunately, but his 2 sons came along. And the other one who went into politics was Sir Henry Gullett's son, Joe Gullett, who was in Parliament for about 12 years. And Joe's now passed on, but his son and daughter were there yesterday. Yeah, some interesting political dynasties and DNA in that aircraft.
Out of curiosity, going to Temora, what condition was the sample plane that they've got down there?
This one,
Mm.
it's in perfect working order.
And is that the one with the more powerful engines?
Yes. Yeah, the planes down, they're remarkable, the aircraft down. This is the only Hudson flying in the world, full stop. They got the Hudson, they got a couple of Spitfires, got a Sabre, they got a Canberra bomber. They've got about 20 airworthy aircraft down there. It is an extraordinary place.
It's amazing. I haven't been there, I've got to go.
It's worth going. They have about 4 or 5 flying, oh no, not that many, a couple of flying days a year. And, you know, they're advertised on their website. And yeah, it's well worth a visit. It really is. And the guys that fly them are volunteers. Doug Hamilton, who flies this one's got a Lockheed 10, which he keeps on his property, which is a similar aircraft. And you might know the Lockheed 10, that was the plane that Amelia Earhart flew in. She crashed somewhere on Howland Island or near Howland Island, was never seen again. But there are photographs of her when I think she visited Australia on the trip. And that's a Lockheed 10, and Doug's got one of those. I've seen the plane, it's a magnificent thing. It's totally, you know, sort of polished aluminium. It's completely silver. The whole plane is silver. If you're interested in machinery, it's a drop-dead gorgeous item.
Go to Washington.
Smithsonian, yeah.
Unbelievable.
Well, they haven't got an airworthy Hudson. Whatever they got in the Smithsonian, they have not got an airworthy Hudson. So for me, it's been wonderful. You know, when you're trying to write like this, to be able to get the experience of going up in the aircraft, there's just no substitute for it. And I gave him chapter 24. Chapter 24 in here is the key flying chapter. And I had all these other pilots, including my son, read it. And some of them picked up errors. And then when I went to Temora, I took the chapter down with me. I said, Doug, will you just read this chapter, please, and make sure that it's okay from your point of view. And I figure if I got the sign off from a Hudson pilot, I was bomb-proof, pardon the pun, with anybody else coming after me. And they do, you know. I mean, and that's understandable. You know, pilots will look very critically at flying chapters in books. That's what you expect. You know, when you publish, you hold yourself out to the world to be criticised, and on technical stuff, technical people will come after you if you've got it wrong. So I counted myself lucky, because there are people who've flown Hudsons alive today. Most of them are in their late 80s and 90s, but as I've discovered, there are a few of them who are sharp as tacks, and they don't miss stuff. So to get the chance to get this signed off by a guy who's still flying, that's the ultimate sort of body armour for critiques of chapter 24, if I can put it that way.
Are you working on another book?
Yes, this one's gone well enough. This publisher, first time it's ever happened to me, publishers come to me and said, we want you to write another book. And they gave me 2 options. One was a history of aviation in Australia. What's the other one? I had enough of flying. It's too hard, you know, it's just too hard. And they said, oh, a history of 20th century Australia. So I said, all right, I'll do the second. That's what I'm doing. It's pretty challenging. I'm up to chapter 7 and going like Billy-O because I'm on a deadline. And it's not original research or a new theory. It's like a narrative history, and you know, just trying to make it readable, and you know, it sort of runs decade to decade and all that sort of thing. Yeah, it's that sort of book, and that's what they want. That's what they want. That's what they said they wanted. So.
Has it got more of a political side to it or a human side to it?
Well, I had a very interesting discussion about that with a publisher, and said I know a little bit about law. There's only one thing I know a fair bit about, and that's politics. And so to the extent that the book has a spine, so to speak, through the story, it will have to be political, because that's what I know, if you want me to do it in this time frame. And then we talked about it a bit and sort of agreed that, well, the really big decisions in history, you know, in a country's history, they end up being political one way or the other. And so you can then hang all sorts of stories off that spine.
It's an enormous...
Well, yes and no, but you got to start somewhere. Well, they've given me 100,000 words. So what I do is say, right, 100,000 words, 10 decades in a century. So that'll be 4 chapters per decade, 40 chapters in all, 2,500 words a chapter. That's the structure. So then you're thinking 4 chapters per decade, and then you're trying to land each chapter in a certain position so you can cover the decade within your 4 chapters. I'm in the middle of World War I at the moment, which is a huge topic, So what you do then is you try to squeeze the first decade down a little bit, so you got a bit more room for World War One at the opening of it, so to speak, and then you try to squeeze the 1920s a little bit in the other direction, so you got a little bit more room for World War One in the other direction. But I'm looking for anecdotal stuff, and rather than trying to describe every battle on the Western Front, you take a couple that you think are representative, and you describe them. You try and get some good quotes to describe what's going on, and then I think you can reasonably conclude, for the purposes of this book, not for military history obviously, that the other battles were similar, which is to say that the Western Front was just a giant stalemate, where people were going backwards and forwards, you know, for very little ground, suffering enormous casualties, and that went on for about 3 years. And then you get that hinge year in 1918 where the Germans broke through, very relevant to Australia because it was all stopped at Villebretonneau. And then Monash alone, but certainly Monash central to it, turned them around the other way, and that's where you then sort of land in and concentrate on that a bit, and of course you do Gallipoli and a bit on Palestine with a light horse. And then you've got to cover the home front to some extent, and the conscription debates. It's amazing what you can get in there. But in the writing, the trick is, look, you know, you could write a 20-volume history of Australia a 50-volume history of Australia in the 20th century. You wouldn't cover everything. So the trick, I think, is for the reader, you cover as much as you can, and you cover things in a way where hopefully the read will keep you propelling through the book and not sort of sitting there thinking, well, why isn't this covered or why isn't that covered? And it doesn't purport to cover everything. Anyway, that's the only way I can do it. And then you try to get in a bit of music, you try and get in a bit of sport, you try and get in a bit of painting. So, you know, like painting. Well, I cover Federation a little bit, the ceremony down at Centennial Park and then the opening of the first Parliament. You can chuck in a little bit of painting with Tom Roberts because he painted, you know, the opening of Parliament, that sort of thing.
Part of, I think, history in another 20 years' time, after all the people that have participated in World War II, not the fighting people, but the home people, and a lot of their experience was something that's not sort of written about. You don't hear about it now. The preparations that people did around Sydney, how they anticipated what was happening, what precautions they were doing. And I came from Berry on the south coast, and the what Navy was down in there, and they built the big airstrip and all that. And my dad was a blacksmith in Berry, and we lived in the house pretty much on top of the hill. And all these fighter planes used to come over, and they'd come about 4 feet above our chimney. You know, the things that happen down in a little town like that, where the blackouts, and when I say blackouts, the VDSs go around looking in for every window, see if there was anybody had a light they could see through, and all that sort of history.
Well, that's probably a book. That's probably a book in its own right.
They just don't even.
The history of the war, you know, that way is written by Paul Hasluck in what I think is a wonderful volume of the official history. But you know, for me, I'm just skimming through a lot of that stuff. There's no room to do otherwise. Anyway, the publisher gives me a job, I do it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff that's not going to be in there, obviously.
Excuse me, would they have been used in the bombing of Darwin? My dad was in Darwin.
I don't know. I'm not look, I know what I write about, and I don't know about Darwin. Not yet. Better find out about it by the time I get to that chapter in this next book.
It's great. It's been terrific. Thank you.
Thanks, mate.
And you'll be able to listen.